The thing about infrastructure is it's boring until it's not.
When the lights go out, the web goes down. It gets super important fast.
And speaking of cell service, T-Mobile and Sprint, is that a good thing?
Plus, just how big is AWS?
I'm Steve Rosenbaum, and this is Future Forward.
I'm Alexa Scordato. Let's launch.
Hey, Alexa, how are you?
Good. How are you, Steve?
I am well. So let's just jump right into this blackout thing. So a couple of weeks ago, the power went out in New York. You were off in Europe sitting with electricity, and I was in New York with no electricity. And it was like charming and lovely in the summer afternoon. And then as it got dark, it wasn't so charming or lovely anymore. And it made me start to think about technology and electronics and infrastructure. And so rather than try and figure it out, I reached out to our friend Glenn Zorpat at IEEE Spectrum and asked him what was going on with infrastructure, and he had a really good answer. So whenever things that are technical happen to me, I default to going to the IEEE Spectrum website first and Googling to see if there's some really detailed article. And so after the blackout in New York a couple weeks back, my first thing to do was go to IEEE Spectrum. And sure enough, there was an article which made me think that we had to talk to Glenn about it. And let me just give it the context. The context is we're biking downtown. The power's out from 72nd Street down. We pull up in front of Lincoln Center and we're like, all right, no big deal. We'll just figure out what's going on. And I pick out my phone and I want to check Twitter and I want to check Facebook or I want to look at the news. And it turns out that not only was the power out, but all internet access was out in that west side chunk of Manhattan. And that made me think, wow, I'm more reliant on the internet for safety information, which brings me to this article that has kind of a surprising conclusion. Maybe talk a little bit about the idea that the safest thing for power grids might be to not have them be high tech. Is that exactly right?
Right. So this has a long history, but just to get back to your intro, there was a power outage in New York City in mid-July that affected 72,000 people, including Steve Rosenbaum.
Yep.
It lasted for 5 hours, and there were people trapped in subway cars, huge walk-in refrigerators for hundreds and hundreds of restaurants went down. There was probably millions of dollars in economic consequence. So, and then just yesterday there was an outage affecting 40,000 people in Washington, D.C. for 4 hours. So it was a little bit smaller than the New York one, but still. We had very abrupt reminders of how much we all depend on our electrical grids, as you pointed out, even for things like internet. So it just so happens that the U.S. House of Representatives followed the U.S. Senate in passing legislation to mandate research into a very radical idea for dealing with the cybersecurity of U.S. grids. So basically the connection here is, in the past couple of weeks, New Yorkers and people who live in Washington got a very poignant reminder and powerful reminder of how much we all depend on these and what could happen to our societies and civilization if we had an extended outage. And it's been known for quite a while that cyber hackers would love to do this. And in fact, in 2015 in Ukraine, Russian cyber hackers brought down one or more power plants. And this was very much a wake-up call to U.S. security that this could be done. The Ukrainian power plants did not have the kind of security that is in place at U.S. plants and networks, but still, it was not dark age primitive security. It did have security, and the Russian hackers brought it down.
And by the way, not to be a conspiracy theorist here, but New York has been pretty close-lipped about what actually happened in that blackout. You expect there to be a standard. We had a transformer blow in this, and they've been, in fact, de Blasio said there was a thing on the west side and a transformer blew, and Con Ed came out and said, hey, slow down there, guy. We don't have proof that that's what happened. And they've never really answered it, which makes me think, who knows? Maybe it was hackers.
Right. There was there were different and largely and somewhat conflicting early reports. Some early reports said it was a transformer fire in a substation on the Upper West Side. Others said it was a relay system problem. So utilities employ these relay systems which control circuit breakers, which are supposed to isolate what's called a fault, typically a ground fault, where basically high voltage line becomes grounded and the flow of current is stupendous, and it would burn out key systems, which would then cause this cascading problem if it wasn't isolated. So there were some reports that these relay systems, which are a key component of these isolation systems, didn't work. But it hasn't been confirmed. As you point out, we don't really know. There isn't a definitive explanation now. There's finger pointing on the part of de Blasio and Andrew Cuomo, and there have been promises from Schumer and Cuomo and others to do independent investigations, but right now we don't know.
I guess the thing I found surprising about the article is, there is this kind of bias that says the thing that we do to make technology better is to build more technology. And
right.
Particularly with alternate forms of energy, solar, for example, it's all about, you need to get solar, other than battery storage, which we'll talk about another day. Like the idea of having grids kind of smartly connected so that you can get the electricity from where it's been generated to the areas that need it most would seem to be essentially a high-tech solution. And what these guys are now talking about is that the safest thing to do for the grid would basically to go back to kind of switches and mechanical devices and get it off less interconnected. Is that right?
That's right. And it goes back to a researcher named Michael Asante. Michael Asante was a brilliant cybersecurity researcher. He worked in naval intelligence for the first part of his career. He then became aware of incredible vulnerabilities in the U.S. electrical grids, and he moved to private sector to the largest or one of the largest electric utilities in all the United States, which is called American Electric Power, which serves a large part of the middle of the United States with electricity. So he worked there, and he was trying to, this is going back to, say, the early 2000s, 2005 or 8 or time frame or thereabouts. So he was trying to raise the alarm on these vulnerabilities. He wasn't getting a lot of traction. So he then made another move to the Idaho National Laboratory, which is one of the U.S. national laboratories in Idaho, where they've really taken the lead on doing cybersecurity for electrical grids. And he organized a test, which was called the Aurora test, which for the first time showed that if you could gain control of one of these utility grids, these control networks that utilities have, you could destroy an electric generating station, an electric dynamo, basically. You could destroy it. I mean, not damage it, but basically the Aurora test, which was filmed, shows basically the generator flying apart physically.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
I have to tell you, being in that blackout, I was in the earlier New York blackout, which was, I guess, 10 years earlier. Being in that one a couple of weeks back, you realize it was very hot out, particularly for people that were frail or elderly. There was no air conditioning. The cascading number of things that New York is, as a city, so many things, subways, food delivery, refrigeration, it makes you wonder how quickly the fiber of society would collapse without electricity. I mean, it wouldn't be weeks. It would be sooner than that.
Yeah, you and I both live in the Northeast, in the New York City area, and we both remember Hurricane Sandy. I was out of power. I live on Long Island in Nassau County. I was out of power for, I want to say, a week or two. And it was in the late fall. It was early November, but it was fairly cool, as it typically is then. And it was pretty uncomfortable.
Yeah,
it was really.
And things like elevators. Like there's no plan B when you don't have an. If you live on the 25th floor, Anyway, so let's switch hats for a second. So as a technologist, does this thesis of we should have the grids be lower tech, like does that rub you the wrong way, or does that seem like
Michael Asante, getting back to this researcher, he considered the various options. I might say just first of all that for many years, for decades, utilities around the world have used a standard network called SCADA to control their systems, their generating plants, their disconnect switches, and other key gear. SCADA stands for, it's SCADA, Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. And it links all of these key aspects of a grid, and it allows for automatic control because demand goes up and down, things happen in a grid quickly, and you don't necessarily want a fallible human being who might be having a bad day or hungover or sick or something controlling these things. You'd rather have the grid taking care of itself. However, Asante, after proving these vulnerabilities with the Aurora test and in other ways, he came to the conclusion that there really wasn't any way you could guarantee the safety and security of the grid except by taking certain key aspects and basically making them separate from the control system. So in other words, they could only be controlled by people or by separate systems that weren't connected or interfacing with the rest of the control network. He concluded this, and these bills in the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate that were just passed basically have agreed with this. They basically said that the leadership, the congressional leadership, agrees with him and mandates research into this very endeavor, which is separating key aspects from the grid, protecting them in a way.
So we're out of time, but I got to just tell you, I saw a trailer last night for the Edison Tesla movie that's coming out in late October, and it made me think there's going to be a lot more conversation to be had about electricity and AC versus DC and how it's come to be kind of the lifeblood of our world. And and these two guys are terrific characters, and it was the trailer was pretty good. So stay tuned. I think we'll have more electricity conversations down the road.
A future conversation.
Thanks, Glenn. So Alexa, so Glenn's answer was that there is a big discussion going on about whether or not the solution to infrastructure is to get it less technical, take it off the web. That seems kind of backwards thinking to me.
I don't know. If you think about, if you think about Apollo 13 or when we had to rescue those divers, recently, was it in Thailand? You actually had a lot of people kind of doing a lot of hacky things. So it's not surprising that we would solve tech or online issues in a more mechanical offline way.
Yeah, I guess. All right, so let's jump to chapter 2 and get into the T-Mobile Sprint thing, because I have some fairly strong feelings about it. First of all, are you either a T-Mobile or a Sprint customer?
I'm not. I'm part of evil AT&T.
So I was AT&T and now I'm Verizon. I've never done T-Mobile. I've never done Sprint. But every time I've been tempted by their low prices, I've been warned away by their mediocre technology. I have a bad feeling about this merger.
Why do you have a bad feeling? I mean, I have a bad feeling about all carriers, and so I guess I don't know if it just taints my whole view of the industry.
I just think they're two kind of hacked together mediocre carriers, and first of all, the merger is going to be incredibly ugly. Just putting together all those towers and all of those deals and all of those, it's just going to be a big, messy, ugly merger.
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't think this is a 1 + 1 = 3. Like, I don't see better technology coming out of it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't necessarily think that they can compete by offering better service, lower rates, better quality, or at least the immediate path to getting there isn't obvious. And I think what's sad for me is that it's just another instance where the world is sort of reinforcing this notion that bigger is supposedly better.
Now the pitch, the sell is that T-Mobile is saying that it's going to speed up their deployment of 5G. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But then aren't there also all these concerns about 5G and negative health benefits of it? Like we're all going to get cancer from 5G?
I guess. All right. And then if you read the Verge article on the merger, there's this paragraph that jumped out at me about midway down the page. I'll just read it to you. T-Mobile's connections to the Trump administration have come under heightened scrutiny as the deal progressed. In March, the Washington Post reported that the company had spent over $195,000 at the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C. while lobbying for the merger. I'm sorry. What do you buy for $200,000 at a hotel? I mean, that's a lot of drinks.
It's totally. I also can't even imagine that the hotel is that nice.
Yeah. So, all right. So the other thing, and then maybe the thing that I'm most, so on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, there are literally T-Mobile and Sprint stores on every other corner, at least so it seems. So half of them are going to go away. And then if you read in the fine print, Dish, in order to get the deal done, Dish is acquiring a whole bunch of the assets of T-Mobile, and Dish is required as part of the deal to build stores.
So I had no idea, but I just read about it. So Dish is going to be the fourth carrier. It's basically going to take that fourth slot.
Yeah.
And in order for this merger to go through, it's getting assets from T-Mobile and Sprint in the form of retail and some infrastructure. I had no idea.
So when I went to argue with Spectrum about my bill a couple of weeks back, they worked really hard to get me to switch over my cell phone account to them. And they said, we're $40 a month, unlimited data. It's much cheaper than anybody else. And I Googled it, and the whole Spectrum mobile offering is basically reselling Verizon tower services.
Wow. Oh, that's weird.
It's weird, right?
It's really weird.
Yeah. So I'm having trouble imagining Dish being the great white hope that's going to come scampering in and save the cell phone service.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, it's a really weird way to buy a service because it's so bundled with other things. Like, don't you find that you keep your plan because you like your phone or you're going to upgrade a phone? It's kind of just easier to just stay where you are.
So I have 3 lines on Verizon, and the problem is if you try to get out of it, they're never all synced up. So
Right.
like one way or another, my son's phone is got 3 more months on it. I have to wait for it. It's a mess. Anyway, I'm not feeling like the T-Mobile Sprint merger is got innovation in it, and maybe some of our listeners want to get back to us and respond to us on Twitter and say, no, you're totally wrong.
To be clear, though, I do root for them to work in the sense that T-Mobile has a best international plan in the sense that you have unlimited roaming on T-Mobile. It's been the one feature that I'm like, oh man, as someone who travels a lot, I wish I could switch to T-Mobile or have a good reason to.
So not to spend the whole podcast on cell phones, but so how does AT&T work with you overseas?
So I actually just wind up buying a local SIM card and taking out my AT&T card. But AT&T did do something this summer that was amazing for the World Cup. If you were in France, your phone worked like it would in the United States. I did not pay for data or international cell service while I was in France this summer.
That's interesting. I'd love to be in the meeting where they decide to do that. All right. So chapter 3, moving on to chapter 3, which is a big, hairy, complicated one. AWS, Amazon announced earnings, and it's the middle of the summer. It's a little bit sleepy, so you have to actually dig into these things. But if you read the numbers, they're kind of shocking. I mean,
AWS is huge. Huge.
Amazon's reporting $63.4 billion in Q2 of 2019 with revenue of AWS is up 37%. Subscriptions are up 37%, and other is up 37%. I don't know what other is.
Right.
Maybe Twitch?
20% sales are up in North America, 12% internationally.
So AWS 37. I mean, really, when you look at the charts and graphs of the size of AWS, it literally is the internet. I mean, what is it? What was the one quote that it's 5 times bigger than its closest competitor?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, as much as that size, here it is. I just found there's a graphic on GeekWire that shows this great big blotch that just basically covers over Microsoft, Google, Alibaba, Salesforce, Oracle, IBM, as cloud provider competitive positioning. But you know, it's hard to be upset with AWS being so damn big because it's really cheap and they don't seem to ever do anything. There are some cases which we can talk about where they do weird billing things not with AWS. But AWS is the only vendor I've ever used in my internet life in which every 6 months they would send you an email and say, we're lowering the price.
Right.
How fabulous is that, right? I mean, we're lowering the price.
But that's kind of the name of the Amazon game, right?
To keep
Amazon buys Whole Foods, all of a sudden it's 30% cheaper, or, you know, they're rolling out new shipping or retailers and things are cheaper.
But unlike, let's save the Amazon food and merchandise conversation for another day, because you could argue that it's doing all kinds of terrible things to retail. But AWS, you know, you can't really feel bad for what's the IBM product, Azure?
That's Microsoft.
Oh, Microsoft, right. You can't really feel bad for Microsoft Azure that AWS is cleaning their clock, right? I mean, nah.
So what's interesting is Azure has been an area that has actually helped strengthen Microsoft's position in recent years. Like, I think Microsoft lost on the mobile front, but their corporate strategy has actually been to be very developer friendly. And so when I was actually working at Stack Overflow, we were a Microsoft stack. Like, we were powered by .NET. And so, but at the same time, we ran physical servers. And the notion of moving into the cloud felt like something that was not likely going to happen. And AWS was definitely out of the question. And so I think there are a lot of companies like that. And so, I mean, Microsoft still has a chance. There are a lot of people that I think want choice.
Yeah,
like developers want choice when choosing their tools, but AWS is super, super dominant. I went to AWS reInvent in Las Vegas a couple years ago. It was a very expensive booth. It was a very big conference. It felt like a Google I/O WWDC scale, and it actually shocked me.
What? Tell me why AWS was out of the question for
Stack Overflow?
Yeah, for Stack.
It was just because it depends in terms of how people design their architecture, but I think there's an aspect of control. People actually like knowing where their servers are.
Yep.
We had data centers, physical data centers. And so this notion of like out of sight, out of mind maybe comes into play when it comes to cloud computing. But AWS has had first mover advantage in the space. They're clearly dominant as a result of that. And it'll be interesting to see if other competitors like Azure or even Google can develop products that will compete. In any meaningful way.
When I was running Magnify, I always lobbied for us to consider AWS as an option, and my developers just came back and said, because of the way our app is designed, it didn't behave well in a scalable infrastructure where it could spin up servers and spin them back down in real time. I'm not a developer, so I never fully understood why it was non-negotiably not going to work, but. I've on my own, just to have some storage space, I've spun up S3 buckets a couple of times, and I gotta say, once you get under the hood, it's not all super user friendly, drag and droppy. It's pretty geeky stuff.
Yeah, we should do a whole other podcast on sort of non-code tech, because there are a lot of people who preach that all of these new services are so easy and people aren't going to have to learn how to be super technical or learn how to code. I think we're still kind of far from that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. All right, well, so just to recap the episode: electricity, good; blackouts, bad. By the way, I saw the trailer for the new Tesla Edison movie that's coming out in October. It's pretty good.
It's good?
Yeah,
Excited about that.
Electricity has not been around for that long, and a bunch of guys, had a pretty bloody fist fight over it. So, so stay tuned for that. And T-Mobile and Sprint, I'd say question mark, but change
We'll
is
see.
good.
TBD.
And AWS, big and getting bigger, and kind of invisible, except when you read the numbers.
Good summary.
Indeed. All right, we are out of time. Have a fabulous week, and we will repod again a week from today.
Great.
Bye.